now I know that my embryos from age 34 are in the cloud. I don't really have to worry that much about, let's say, the quality of the embryo from a very top-down perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it gives me a lot of peace of mind. And after I did it, I actually recommend it to a lot of my friends because I think that as women, we give ourselves a lot of pressure in terms of, marriage, in terms of children, in terms of work. I think there's just too much pressure that we put on ourselves that it's just one thing that you don't have to think about as much after you've gone through it.
Let's talk about X, baby. Let's talk about she and he. Let's talk about all the good and bad things on fertility. Let's talk about X, baby. Let's talk about she and he. Let's talk about all the good and bad things on fertility. Let's talk about X. Let's talk about X.
Hello and welcome to the How Would You Like Your Ex podcast. I'm Dawn Chan, founder of Seoul Fertility, a community and platform that empowers women on their fertility journey. In each episode, we invite guests to share their thoughts on fertility preservation, how they are navigating their fertility journey, and topics related to their choice. In this episode, we've got Judy, who's South Korean and have been in Hong Kong for about 10 years. Ever since finding love in Hong Kong, she's never looked back. And recently, she has frozen her embryos for her husband in Hong Kong. Welcome, Judy.
Thanks for having me, Dawn.
Great. I remember we first talked about embryo freezing about maybe a year ago when you mentioned that you were thinking about taking a career break from your very, very high-stress finance job. And when we talk about it, I mentioned my own personal experience, and you said, oh, you may be thinking about that as well. Do you mind sharing a little bit more about how you got started thinking about this?
Yeah, I think initially I thought of this because after getting married, I think the natural step is to think about children. And I think in the jobs that we work in, especially in metropolitan cities, it's very easy to get caught up in what you're doing, not to really think about family planning even after you've gotten married. I think it's more common in Hong Kong and especially around my friends these days. And so as I'm getting older, naturally I start to think about my biological clock. I start to think about my health. And as you mentioned, I had a health scare as well. And so that made me really think about my own journey in terms of how I wanted to be in control over my health and my timeline for fertility. And I think really the impetus of the decision really came from a few people around me that had also frozen their embryos or frozen their eggs. And I saw them being more relaxed about their timeline in terms of when they wanted to have children. And I think thankfully now, because of technology and medical advances, we actually have a lot more control over that. And so I decided to take that option for that reason. And I'm really glad that I did do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about your biological clock ticking, how old were we talking about when you and your husband were thinking about this decision?
Yeah. I froze my embryos when I was 34.
Okay.
I'm 35 now. And so from what I heard from my doctors and from doing a little bit of research online, after the age of 35, the quality of your eggs and your egg count goes down significantly. And so I just wanted to catch that window as soon as I could.
Yeah.
And so, that really led to the decision.
And you mentioned your health scare as well. I think you recall that it relates to a cyst, right,
Yes.
in your ovaries. And in that moment, finding out that, your ovaries has a normal cyst and talking to your gynecologist about it, what was that conversation look like? And was fertility preservation in that conversation with the doctor?
Yeah. Actually, because of the cyst, I found out that I wasn't ovulating properly.
Oh.
And so it was really an option of, do you want to get rid of your cysts? And that made me think about ovulation, which made me think about freezing my eggs and children and whatnot. Because I think if you asked me last year when I was freezing my embryos, I wasn't really ready to have children at the time. I know a lot of people say that there really is never the right time, but that's also the reason why I didn't do the embryo transfer right away, is because I just felt like my husband and I were not ready for that stage of our lives. And so I think because of the health scare, I decided to think about my health more actively, and hence it led to the embryo transfer.
And I think a lot of things were happening in the past year for you. You were taking a break from your finance job. You were thinking about dealing with a cyst. You were thinking about embryo freezing. And obviously, when it comes to embryo, your husband's also in the mix. How do you think about all those things at the same time? How do you tackle them?
Yeah, I think initially the conversation really came up about children because a lot of people around us were starting to have children. And I think we're both quite realistic people. And so we wanted to have a very active discussion around, okay, when are we going to have kids? Realistically, if we are going to have kids, let's say 2 to 3 years from now, then we need to start trying, probably now. But, I don't think there's a perfect answer for everyone. But I think for us, it was just really a very honest conversation about, okay, when do we want to have kids? If it's not now, then I think we should take a more active approach to freezing our eggs or freezing our embryos. And we didn't really have that much information about it, to be honest. We had just heard a lot of anecdotes from people around us. And I think there's still a bit of taboo around the whole subject because even my friends and some ex-colleagues or colleagues that had done the process, I hadn't heard that much about the entire process. And even some of my friends that are thinking of doing it now, I think they're still a bit in the dark in terms of what the process is actually like.
Yeah. So on that, why don't you share a little bit more details around your process from the first day that you and your husband agreed on, let's explore this embryo freezing, to the day after your embryos are frozen. Walk us through a little bit more on the details and what you were really hearing, the discussions you had with your fertility specialists.
So, I mean, for me, I had heard that a lot of people in Hong Kong went to a certain clinic, but I actually ended up going to a different clinic because my doctor also happens to be he also handles the birth of certain children. And so he's like a gynecologist slash a fertility doctor. Yeah. Exactly. And so he came very highly recommended from a friend because he delivered 2 of her babies. And so I didn't do that much thorough research on that front because it felt like a lot of it was word of mouth anyways. And so that's how I chose my doctor. And after I met with him, I felt relatively comfortable in terms of the process. But I think realistically, I didn't really know exactly what questions to ask because the whole process itself, globally, I feel it's sort of a black box, right? So you don't really know exactly what you're getting into, the types of questions that you need to ask, what type of results that you're expecting. Because I think as of now, because it's not a regulated industry per se, and there's no company or let's say, like Seoul Fertility, where you can get access to information very readily. It's really difficult to know exactly what to ask or what questions to ask. And so I think for me, the process was relatively simple just because I just didn't know what I was getting into. And I think it was only, after I met with my doctor and then decided, okay, I want to do embryo freezing because I had heard that the chances of an embryo becoming a successful child later on is higher versus actually using, just a frozen egg. Yeah. Actually, the analogy that I had heard from a friend is that like egg freezing versus embryo freezing is egg freezing is like freezing the crust of a pie, and embryo freezing is like freezing a pie. And so you'll get a more successful pie to eat after,
like from a frozen
from a frozen pie. If you just freeze the crust, then you actually have to build onto the crust to get a successful pie.
Yeah. So adding on just a little bit of statistics, usually gynecologists or fertility specialists quote this number. So from eggs to successful childbirth is around 10 to 20%. So assuming you've got 20 eggs, 10 to 20% of that could result into a live birth embryo transplanted successfully into your womb. Versus in terms of embryo, your chances of success is a lot higher, putting you at probably around 30 to 40% of your embryos would lead to a successful implantation, right, into a live birth. So that's sort of the number difference that you'll be looking at.
I see. Very helpful.
Yeah.
So yeah, after my initial consultation with my doctor, I just decided, okay, well, he seems to know what he's doing. He has a lot of experience delivering children, and he came very highly recommended. And so why not? And so I went through the process, and I mean, I think for me, one thing that was very helpful is that he had a very hands-on nurse that followed up with me throughout the process, made sure I was okay. Gave some useful information. But I think for me, what would have been most helpful is trying to figure out, okay, well, what exactly am I trying to achieve? And if I get to that result, then how do I get to the next step? Because the actual process is quite long, right? It doesn't start from doing the shots and then the freezing and then it's done, right? The actual process is actually quite cumbersome in some ways and very physically taxing. And so I feel like if I had known a bit more about what the side effects could be and what the actual result would be after, then it would have given me a lot more ammo to ask the right questions in the right way.
I think one thing we talk to our clients a lot is what are their sort of preferences and desires when it comes to that fertility journey. Being more upfront in terms of what you want would help you, like you said, because you know your goals, better communicate with your doctor when it comes to what fits you in terms of the treatment. So when we talk about, the questions that you may want to think about, for example, time storage comes into play because in Hong Kong you can only store for 10 years. So one of the most key important questions we ask our clients is when is the first child you want to have in terms of time, but also when is your last child?
Right.
Because starting, yes, if you're freezing at around 34 and you want to have your first child before 40, that makes sense. But what if you want your last child around 44, 45? You need to know that in order to get a sense of when you should be freezing as well, especially in Hong Kong. So it's important to know what your end goal in a way is, have a sense of that before going into the treatment. And when you mentioned that, it could be a bit taxing, that the journey is long, not just a hormonal process, what were you referring to for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me in general, I don't like shots. And so the process of actually having to inject yourself with a shot every day for 2 weeks, roughly 2 weeks is it's a daunting process for me. Like I barely was able to get my COVID shots. And so it was just very daunting for me to go through that. But I think, even after, everyone's process is very different. But for me, I was just very, I felt a bit more emotional than normal, but I knew that it was coming from the hormone imbalance and just you're just injecting yourself with hormones. And so I knew it was coming from that. So I knew that it would pass, but I don't think there are enough resources or people really talk about exactly what to expect. And so I kind of wish that I had a little bit more support from that perspective.
Yeah. And one difficult thing about that is also it's different for different people.
Right.
Some people can get a bit more emotional and like cry every day, or some people can not feel a thing and completely fine. Some of our clients said they were really sleepy. They wanted to nap every day.
Right.
And I personally just got really constipated after the process. So I think it really varies, and that's why it becomes a little harder, especially to find to know whether your side effects is normal, whether it's with of range. And it's so important to be able to speak to the professional and be in touch with your clinic, with your nurses, and to just check in sometimes when it happens, because you may not be always able to find your doctor.
Right.
That's why your clinic and nurses are so important, because they become a part of the support system as well.
Right. I agree. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for you, okay, once getting over that, I guess, needle stage, how helpful was your husband in this process? Did he do your needles?
Yeah, he helped me with that, which was great, because I definitely wouldn't have been able to inject myself. And I think, Yeah, I mean, I'm realistically outside of that because it's your own physical journey, although your husband is involved from a chemical perspective. I think realistically, one thing that women have to realize that it's their body, it's their choice. And so I think once you're more aware of what to expect, then maybe it won't be as taxing on people. Because I feel like that's, when I hear about pregnancy from friends that have been pregnant or that have given birth, I feel like I've heard a lot more raw stories now. Not that I'm better prepared for it when that comes, but I think now it's not more of like a fantasy of having a baby and you're not romanticizing the process, but it's actually become more of a reality. And so after having gone through the process, and even when some friends ask me like, what was the process like? I try to give them a very honest answer. But even after speaking to you, after I had gone through the process, I think it was helpful that you asked me questions like, hey, did you ask your doctor like this, and this? Like, were you given the option of this, and this? And I actually had no idea what you were talking about. And so I think it's great that there's these types of resources available now because, I think there's just too much information online that you also don't know which source to trust. Although some are like medically, from medical professionals, some are from individual laboratories. There's no centralized process. So I just feel like it's just information overload, which is also another reason why I didn't really research into it too much because there isn't really consistency of information as well. So I think that's why people tend to trust the people around them more and depend more on word of mouth than anything.
No, that is true. What we found when we were doing our research is that there's a lot of information online on maybe the medical process piece, right? In terms of maybe the details around the fertilization even and what happens in storage. But what is missing out there is how do you get into that, right? What is the planning process like for you as a patient, as a client? How do I make those decisions? What are the types of questions I'll be asking? Because everyone's different. So it's really hard online to tell you these are the 10 questions you need to ask. But it's more about also a process of teaching you how to self-advocate for yourself. How do you connect with your doctor and communicate with your doctor on what you need and what you're feeling and what you should be expecting, right? So almost like learning the language to be more self-advocating in the process of medical treatments, I find is actually most helpful, not just in the egg freezing or embryo freezing process, but also in any other medical treatments that you will be getting, whether for elective reasons or for medical reasons.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think for me, the one thing that's been most striking is that amongst my friends that have gone through the process, some of them have been successful and some have not. And I think there's a stigma around, okay, well, if you're healthy, you work out, you don't drink, and you do all the right things, then you must be able to have a successful transplant. And from what I've observed, it seems not to be true. And so then it kind of leads to the question of, then what does lead to a successful transplant? Although I think, you can't figure out 100% exactly how to get there. I think there probably are better ways to ask certain questions to figure out, okay, for me, for my body, from my hospital, as you mentioned, the resources that you can try to get if you know what questions to ask. And I think the conclusion that I've reached is that some of my friends or some people around me that have gone through the process, for example, they didn't know that certain grading of embryos or certain grading of eggs is important. And a lot of them suggested to me, oh, before you do the transfer, you should make sure that the grading of your embryo is good enough to actually transplant, because once you do the actual embryo transplant, it's another taxing process, right? And so they're like, you don't want to go through it again, so make sure that you're transferring a good embryo, right? And then that leads to another question, like, what is a good embryo, right? And so I think it kind of I think it's two things. I think it's knowing exactly what the actual product is, right? Which in this case is the embryo, and then also knowing exactly how to successfully use that product, and so having the right framework, right? And so it's like, how do you know which laboratories to use? How do you know like which are good doctors to use? And so I think, it's almost like a consumer's choice where, if we go to restaurants, if we use, a hair salon, whatnot, then there's Yelp, there's, Table Log, whatever, in each country. country, but I think being able to have and share that process would be extremely helpful for a lot of people that I know. And even for me, if I had that available to me, then it would have been a lot smoother for me as well.
I think informational transparency is what you're trying to get at.
Yeah,
right
exactly.
now. So especially when it comes to the freezing process, it's already less complicated from the full-on IVF process where you've already run into some infertility issues and whatnot, and you should be better able to make this more transparent and upfront for a lot of people who are interested in this topic. I think one thing you touched on just now is embryo grading. And before we even get into what embryo grading is, let's talk a little bit more about fertilization, because I think the biggest difference between egg freezing and embryo freezing here is the process of fertilization. So egg freezing, women go through it, hormonal stimulation, and then once their ovaries and follicles are mature enough, through egg retrieval, the doctor would collect the eggs out. The embryologist will then take a look at which are the mature eggs and then freeze the mature ones, right? And when we're talking about embryo freezing, we're talking about one step further, right? We're talking about once we've selected the mature eggs, we're now going to fertilize them. So the step of fertilization, when I was going through, I realized that there are actually two ways to do it, and I didn't know until I pushed and asked the questions. One way is the traditional IVF. So that means in a petri dish, you've got your sperm, you've got your eggs, and they will mate on their own, right? They're allowed to mix on their own and fertilize. That's traditional IVF. Now there's a second method called egg-C, so intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And the reason that exists is especially for cases where there's male infertility, your sperm count is low, your sperm motility is not as good, then the embryologist will help select your sperm and inject it into an egg, right? And so there are actually two ways to do it. And I personally was pretty upset in my process because I wasn't given a choice. I went to LA thinking that there were two choices, and only when I've arrived and I've talked to the doctor and I was about to sign a consent form in my process did I realize this clinic does not provide traditional IVF. Now, the reason why I care is that we're doing it for elective reasons. So, my husband's sperm quality was actually fine, and I felt that, rather than taking some additional risks, which actually does have a little bit, even though there is still insufficient medical research on it, is that there could be higher risk of congenital abnormalities and autism, right? And that is currently still medical research to figure out whether that's related to the egg-C process or the sperms that are actually naturally weaker. That's why they needed egg-C, right? But in this process, I felt like we didn't really need additional risk, and I would have chosen the traditional IVF. And we weren't really given a choice. I was literally day one of my cycle and ready to get the injections, and then I realized that it wasn't offered to me as a choice. That was one of the most frustrating points for my process. And I don't know whether for you were aware that there were two options and what you pick.
Yeah, I wasn't aware. It was only after I spoke to you that I realized that there were two options, but I did the traditional IVF. I looked into it after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
good.
but only after you asked me about it, because I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is one thing that's really key when it comes to also more complicated steps after the retrieval part. When it comes to fertilization, it's important to ask the specific questions around how is the fertilization going to be done. One reason why certain doctors would recommend egg-C also because of obviously the male infertility causes, but also it gives you a greater chance of success of fertilization.
Right.
So when it comes to couples who had failed cycles and other medical reasons, potentially then doctors could advise and would be more supportive of using egg-C. And so it's always good to check in with your doctor for the options and why that is the case. But again, I think transparency is so important in knowing what choices that you have and what's available to you.
Right.
So I think that's one major thing around fertilization.
Right.
Yeah. And then after fertilization, there is the embryo grading. So that's actually the pre-implantation genetic testing. And so it is a process in which you can test the genetic abnormalities or chromosome abnormalities that may or may not exist in your embryos. And then through that process, you also get a grading, like a bond grading, to be honest, for your embryos. And it's actually provides an indication of risk, of your implantation risk. So it's really good as a prediction for getting a sense if you may have miscarriage risks.
Right.
So that is usually quite helpful for that. But actually in Hong Kong, couples are not, only couples over 35 years old who have had repeated miscarriages or have known hereditary genetic disease, or they allowed to actually do PGD testing. So that's something that you need to think about also when it comes to embryo freezing or even IVF, that not everyone may be eligible for that genetic testing in Hong Kong.
I see.
Did you guys do genetic testing?
No, we didn't.
Yeah.
Good to know. Learning something new every day.
Yeah, so I think you could potentially explore, just check in with your doctor when you actually do the embryo transfer, whether you can do that then. But it's also, obviously good to know more upfront.
Right.
But sometimes people also don't do it, and it's fine. But it is a sort of another tool or analysis available. And it comes with its merits, and also sometimes, especially for couples who already have very few embryos, they may choose actually not to do PGD, because then once you've tested it and it's sort of considered not very good, they may be discarded instead. But maybe actually once you implanted it, some other genetic material will self-correct itself. It is also a possibility. So it is important to check in with your doctor, definitely, to see what your options are when it comes to genetic testing before your embryo transfer.
Got it.
Yeah. So for you now, after you did your embryo freezing, how was that like in terms of the process after the egg retrieval? Was the clinic in touch with you, sort of connecting with you after the retrieval, talking to you about, hey, this is how the success rate is like and whatnot? How did that look like for you?
Yeah, I didn't really get any statistics around it. I think just after the actual retrieval, the clinic reached out to me to say, like, look, this is how long you can freeze it for, and these are the prices. And so to give ourselves as much optionality as possible, I chose the longest freezing period. And also because, I mean, let's say for whatever reason you have one successful transfer, maybe you love children, and then when you're 45, you decide you want to have another, right? And so I think it's just good to keep your options open.
Exactly.
But no, I mean, there wasn't too much follow-up, to be honest, except for like, this is what you owe, and this is how long that you want to freeze it. It kind of reminded me of like wine storage. Just
sort of stick it in and forget about it.
Exactly.
And then a few years later, maybe you pop a bottle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so in your process now that is sort of completed, what were things that you wish you knew beforehand, and or that is out of your expectation?
Yeah, I think I wish I knew that it would have more physical and emotional impact during the process, because I think it's actually a lot harder than people speak about. But I think that also goes with the entire pregnancy process as well. Not that I've been through it, but from what I've heard. But I think just in general, just being able to know what potentially you could expect would have been helpful. Secondly, I think it would have been helpful to ask more of the right questions, because I think ultimately everyone's trying to get to the same end goal, which is to have a healthy child. And so in order to get there, and in order for it to be as less taxing, the least taxing on the mother's body, then like how can you do that? Because I cannot imagine going through the embryo transfer more than once. Like I cannot imagine doing another IVF cycle. And I know a few people around me that have done it multiple times. And so I find that very, not courageous. I mean, courageous, and also I just feel like it's just very taxing. disposing. And so just to understand that, okay, well, if it doesn't work out the first time, then you need to ask the right questions to hopefully make sure that the second time, then you get to the result that you want. But I wish that I was better equipped with the right questions, as I mentioned, and just the right knowledge in terms of what the whole entire process is like. And I think the process is different for everyone because every woman's body is different. And so being able to know exactly for my body type, for where we're at in the cycle, and when exactly we want to do the transfer, like what's right for us. And I think that's different for everyone. So being able to have a bit more of a specialized process would have been more helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is the role of your husband in this process?
Yeah, I mean,
what did he do well and what he did not do well?
Yeah. He was very good at injecting me with the shots. Yeah, and I think in general he was fine. Yeah, what did he not do well? I think, he could have been a little bit more emotionally supportive, I guess, but also like I'm also not the type to like speak about it that openly as well, and so I think it goes both ways. But yeah, I think that's about it. But I think also for men in general, they really don't ask that many questions. Like, for example, I had a friend recently that also did a second cycle of the implant. So they failed the first time, and then they tried again the second time, and they failed, and so they're going to try again the third time. And I asked him, did you guys freeze your embryos or your eggs? And he didn't even know the answer to that question.
Oh no.
Yes. But I find that this is actually quite common amongst the husbands because they just also don't know what the right questions to ask. And also I think men are more results oriented sometimes, and so they only just want to see the result, right? And so, which is the baby. And so I just find that very interesting. I don't know. I think maybe some guys are a bit more detailed and they want to do the research and understand like how they get there. But I think in general, because of the lack of resources and not knowing, as I mentioned again, like the right questions to ask, then it's really difficult for guys to also ask the right questions as well.
So it seems like probably as a husband, I think from my perspective, when I was going through my process, was helpful. Yes, the needles, but also then asking the right questions, being more preemptive and helping me think through the process so that I feel like I'm not the only one who's trying to problem solve this process and this treatment through, and even the follow-ups, right? So after the treatment, the numbers and whatnot was just helpful if he was the primary person to follow up with the clinics. We moved our embryos from the clinic to a cryo bank actually in LA, and so he was in charge. It was helpful that he was in charge of making the logistics happen. I think those things are also always helpful when you're not, the men don't need to do the needles, don't need to do the retrieval. I think at least being the logistical support, emotional support would help a long way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what did your family think about this? Did you talk to them?
Yeah, I mean, not really, to be honest, because I think for them as well, like especially my parents, they're from a different generation, and so like for them, it's kind of like, okay, well, that's great that at least you're thinking about it, right? And so I think for them as well, they also just don't know exactly what the right questions to ask. When I spoke to my sister about it, I think she was a bit more well-informed because she's also in medicine. And so she was like, oh, a lot of my friends have done it. It's probably going to be a very difficult process, but it's also a very standardized process. It's just, you just need to know exactly what you're getting into and what to expect. And so that was helpful. But I think in general, like the person that you're probably going to be closest to in the process, from my experience, is your husband, and more than that, yourself. No.
So why did you guys choose Hong Kong over South Korea and going to Seoul to do the treatment? It seems like it's a lot cheaper in Seoul, right?
Yeah, it is. I think, well, the process itself is anywhere from like 2 weeks to a month, right? The actual shots are about 2 weeks, and then the actual follow-ups before and after, I think it equates to about 1 month. I just felt like it wasn't realistic to be in Seoul for that long of a time. And I think it's important to have a good emotional support system. For me, it was my husband. And he was in Hong Kong. And so I didn't even think about doing it in Seoul. Although I heard that the process, I heard that a lot of people I know also did their process there. But I think in general, it's just, for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. But I also did hear that in places that are a bit cheaper, the process is like more of like a factory. And so it's less of a personalized process. And even maybe I feel like I wish the process had been better. Like, I think maybe in a place like Seoul or in like Thailand, or you maybe even in Taiwan, that process is a lot less personal.
I guess they will also try, I guess, to be personal, but when it comes to like just to flow a lot of people and whatnot, it's actually always really challenging to try to figure out how to be more personalized to deliver a treatment that could be different for different people as well. Yeah. So when you're thinking about, now that you have completed your treatment, how do you guys think about kids? Like, how do you feel that it's now outsourced or stored into? I sometimes like to say that I've uploaded onto the cloud.
Yeah.
But how does it feel like?
Yeah, I feel less pressure from a time perspective, which is great. And although there's some element of that, because I think realistically recovering from a pregnancy at a younger age is a lot easier versus when you're in your mid to late 30s. But I think because now I know that my embryos from age 34 are in the cloud, I don't really have to worry that much about, let's say, the quality of the embryo from a very top-down perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it gives me a lot of peace of mind. And after I did it, I actually recommend it to a lot of my friends because I think that as women, we give ourselves a lot of pressure in terms of, marriage, in terms of children, in terms of work. I think there's just too much pressure that we put on ourselves that it's just one thing that you don't have to think about as much after you've gone through it.
Yeah. When you talk about, motherhood, giving birth, actually South Korea recently declared the low birth rate as a national crisis, right? So you guys basically from, I think, 2023, their birth rate is now down to 0.72. So it's actually quite low and the lowest among regional countries, especially. The government has also thrown out like 2 million won as incentives to new couples for childbirth and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to be really kicking in yet in terms of making much progress on the baby making side. With your experience, and obviously you grew up a little bit in South Africa, not South Africa, oh my God, South Korea. What do you think about that? Like, why is it that South Koreans are quite hesitant to have kids?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's structural because the educational system in Korea is challenging. And so a lot of it requires a lot of financial resources, a lot of time, a lot of help. And I think receiving help in Korea is not as readily available as, let's say, a place like Hong Kong, where getting help is easier and it's a lot more affordable. But I think even then, like, the help equation doesn't necessarily equate to a higher number of children being produced, as we see in Hong Kong as well, right? And so I think it's just really, the function of structurally it's difficult for women to get help. It's a lot more expensive to raise children. And so you need both parents to be working, but then if both parents are working, then who's going to take care of the child? And so I think it's just a lot of realistic questions that that mothers and couples in the country have to answer to. And I think a lot of them just decide, like, okay, like, for me to send my child to, to try to send them to a good school and good after school education, I'd rather use that money to kind of enjoy our lives more. And I think South Korea specifically, it's actually one of the highest educated countries in the world, and so a lot of people go to college, and but does that necessarily equate to more jobs, more opportunities? Not really. And so then, okay, then you have a child, but then there's just the endless amount of worries after that. And I think because of all of those things, I think it's more structural. I think, but I do think that if there was more affordable help, more help that's more readily available, then those statistics could change, but I don't think in a very significant way, in my opinion.
And how culturally receptive is the South Korean sort of community or culture to fertility preservation?
Yeah, I think even more in South Korea, the topic is a lot more taboo. Taboo in the sense that, not that it's something that people frown upon, but people just don't talk about it very openly. And I think it's just people are very image conscious, and so they don't want to talk about, well, I'm not married yet, or my husband and I cannot conceive. And so these are just topics that are tough for people to talk about in general. But I think it's important to have these conversations because especially if you want to have a child, and if that's what you want to achieve, then it's important to, again, have the resources to ask the right questions. And I think part of the reason why a lot of women are not able to ask the right questions is because they don't want to talk about it. And so I think having those resources potentially available could be a big game changer for people wanting to go through with the process, because either they don't know about it or they don't understand what options are available to them.
And do you think the generation above is approving of fertility preservation and egg freezing, embryo freezing in South Korea?
I think the generation above are probably happy that if, let's say, their son or daughter, or, well, in this case, if their daughter is not married, then they're happy that they're actually thinking about having children, versus not at all. And so I think they're supportive of it from that perspective. But I think the generation above also don't really understand what the exact implications, the side effects, what it actually means. I think they're just glad that, let's say, if their daughter decides to freeze their eggs, then if they're not married, then at least we have
grandchildren later
exactly.
on.
I think that's what they're glad about. Yeah.
Yeah. Results oriented.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, in Hong Kong, even part of the reasons why we doing this podcast is to also just open up the conversation a little bit more on the topic. I think in Hong Kong we are talking a little bit about this a little bit more, but mostly still behind closed doors, like amongst friends. I think my age, early 30s, people are talking and asking, "Hey, are you thinking about egg freezing and whatnot?" But when it comes to really openly sharing stories, we're still not there exactly yet. And I think the generation above us, sort of my parents' generation, I think some of them are a bit more open-minded, but I think a lot of them are still probably prefer for us as a couple, and also for their single daughters, just get married and have kids now, soon, rather than putting them in a freezer.
Right.
And so, those voices, I think, contributes to part of, I think, a lot of self-doubt in a lot of women I speak to who are thinking about egg freezing. They're still single. They're still super busy as a lawyer or banker, and honestly have a boyfriend or have a husband, but they're really not ready yet to have kids. And it's not just about money; it's about the time spent, the flexibility of their time, being able to spend time with the children is something that I think my generation cares a lot more about now, as if they think about themselves being parents. And so. Not being there yet, and I think that sense of disapprovement amongst the parents level or the society or the culture sometimes also sort of pull them back when it comes to choosing to take more ownership of their fertility journey and freeze their eggs or embryos.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately every woman is in charge of their own body and their own future. And so I think if you know that eventually that there's even a possibility that you may want a child, then electing to freeze your eggs or your embryos is an excellent option, because at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of things that people around you are not going to that there's going to be a lot of things that people around you are going to disapprove of, whether it's your parents, your friends, whatever people think. At the end of the day, I think it really doesn't matter. And so it's really just, you know your own truth, you know what you want. And so if that's even an option, even if you haven't met the person that you're going to be having the baby with, the success of creating a healthy child is higher if your eggs are younger, right? And so I think electing that option is something that I would recommend to everyone. Yeah.
And what would you say to people who are thinking about embryo freezing but a bit hesitant because of thinking about this more ethically? How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think that answer is different for everyone. I think from our perspective, it's just what works for us as a couple in our timeline. And from an ethical perspective, I think it's just really more about, okay, well, we want children, but not necessarily right now. And we don't know how many children that we want, but it's for us, it's just more about, okay, well, I think we're just looking for healthy children, and that's the result that we're looking for. And so if I'm being very honest, I don't think we've really thought about the philosophical or ethical implications of what it means. I know it's a bit more topical these days, especially in the United States, but I think for us it wasn't really a consideration.
No. That's good. So for when you talk with your friends, say after you've gone through the process, you advise them, say, hey, you should be doing this. How do you talk to them about this?
I just tell them about my process and just say, look, I'm really glad I did it. If there's ever any thought in your head that that's something that you want in the future, then I think this is a really great option, because then it's just one less thing to worry about. Yeah.
For women who are still hesitating, who are still thinking and not so sure about this, what will you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone knows their own truth. And so if there is even a possibility that you think that you may want a child, even though you're unsure in this very moment, then I think being able to have your options available to you, while we live in a day and age where technology and healthcare is a lot more advanced than in the previous generation, right? And so I think we should be taking advantage of that. And I think also we should be doing adequate research so that we know exactly what we're getting into and the right questions to ask. Which is why I think it's so great that you started this company, and there's a lot of really useful resources, not only from you but also from your Instagram page and the resources that you have. And so I think just be resourceful and just be honest with yourself in terms of what you want. And if that's not what you want, then that's okay too, right? It's not for everyone, but if that is what you want, then do your research and make sure that you're giving yourself optionality, because you just don't know what you'll want 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? So.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy, for being with us today and sharing so much about your process. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I hope the conversation today was helpful. And if you like our content, do remember to subscribe to our channel and check us out on our website and all social media platforms. Thank you. See you in the next episode.